So in yesterday's class, we were discussing about the model of the web service, service providers, service brokers, and service requesters. I showed you the structure of how a digital file looks like, and discussed about web services standards. And we also talked about namespace. What is a queue name? Queue name is a combination of the web server name combined with the web service path and all the elements of the digital. So we discussed about how the digital works and a SOAP message and how the SOAP or HTTP request will be sent. So let's talk about, we talked about how the input request and output message in case of RPC request looks like. Whereas in document style, the XML element is one part instead of S1 and S2. Here in this example, I told you that the element will be concat request. So the difference between RPC and we discussed about the difference in RPC versus document, and most of the times you'll be using web service style as document and encoding as literal. The other format is RPC encoded format, which is not frequently used now. So let's start discussing what we also talked about message, and you were able to explain me what this means in a digital. Let's start with operation. So message, you have defined what is the content of message and what are the parts of the message, which are arguments in the message. Now you need to group them into what are those, out of those messages, what are the input messages and what are the output messages. So when you group them, you will put them into a port type, and all those, if you see here, these port types will have operations, and operation will have an input message and an output message. So the web service doesn't directly contain list of operations, and even those operations have to be grouped into a port type. Instead, operations are grouped into one or more port types. You can think of a port type something similar to a Java class, and each operation in it is a static method. For example, in the web service, you can have a port type named string-util containing operations for strings, while having another port type named date-util containing operations for dates. And when you group all those operations, that will become a port type. And the name of the port type must also be a queue name. So it will have its own namespace and its own name. Operation defines which message is the input and which message is the output. So here if you see, there is a weather related web service, and you have an operation called get temperature, and there is an input message or a method name get temperature, and output is get temperature response. The output method is get temperature response. So when you provide this visual to your service requesters or the users, by looking at the visual, they will be able to understand that they need to call this method get temperature, which is available in this operation, to get the temperature response, and it is available in this port type. Visual has 4 transmission primitives. One way is visual input and visual output and fault messages. So it's not only input and output. Suppose something goes wrong, even before the method in the web service gets called, the fault message has to be returned back to the user. So this is that is defined by fault, visual fault. So we'll come back to that, but for now, if you can understand the messages, input and outputs, output messages are segregated, are grouped into operation, and all the operations are inside port types. And once you have port type, continuing our earlier discussion, you see this pictorial representation of what we are talking. So you have a web service, and there are 2 port types. one is a string util and the other is date util. And string util has couple of operations within this namespace. Here you see the port type is also in the same namespace. The namespace of the port type can be same as the operation namespace, or it can be different also, doesn't matter. And this port type date util has two more operations, and these operations can be something else. Here it is concat and bar, and these operations can be something else. And within those operations, you will have input messages and output messages. So the next one in the visual structure is binding. Let me open the visual structure that we are talking about yesterday. This is the access to admin console. When I am going to show you how to deploy an access related web service, I will explain you how to upload a service and how to look at the available services. So for now, let me open the available services and go to the visual for our stock code service example. Let me minimize all the types. So we talked about the visual types and wherein all the schema definitions will be available. Yesterday we saw a concat request example for document style where you define the complex type and sequence S1 and S2. So this is where in the visual types element we define all the schema. Okay, so you define the schema within the visual types element. And you saw what is visual message. So in this case it is get price request and get price response. Supposing these are two visual messages, when you define your port type, in the port type element you are specifically mentioning that get price request is of type input and get price response is of type output. Here you see there is no fault or exception handling. So that is another area where this is another place where you can add visual fault also. So you group these operations. There are two operations. There is also an update operation. So you define two operations and each operation has input and output messages. Update output is not mandatory. In case of update, you just need to update the value of the stock symbol. So output is not mandatory. So in this case of operation, you have only input. And once you define these two operations, you group them into a visual port type. So that is clear. Now next comes the visual binding. Yesterday I told you that visual binding, first you need to define what is the transport, and if you don't define transport here, and you also need to define style of the web service. So in the SOAP binding here, you are defining and transport as HTTP, style as document, and for each input, SOAP body as literal. So this is what I was referring to, document literal. Okay. So for each visual input, visual output, and visual input for the other operation, for each operation you are defining what is the SOAP body usage. The use is literal. Literal means the content of the message will be taken literally and the content is not in an encoded format. So literal is just the literal usage. So after port type, now we have to define the bindings. Now let's look at the details of the binding. A port type may allow you to access it using different message formats. The message format that you have seen is called Simple Object Access Protocol format. So when you define visual, any questions? All right. So when you define visual and you are using a visual format, visual to describe your services, you are using web service of type web services standards called JAX-WS. Okay, Java API for XML web services. Before JAX-WS, the standard was JAX-RPC. That's why I explained you about how RPC web service looks like and what is the difference between an RPC and a document style. So here we are talking about JAX WS web services, in which you have SOAP and digital structures. When it comes to binding, it is possible to say that the string util port type may also support a plain text format. So it's not necessary that the transportation is HTTP. It's not fixed. It depends on what you define, how the transportation should be in the binding. So binding is the place where you define the message format and the transportation type and all those. In addition to the message format, a port type may allow the message to be carried in an HTTP post request or by an email. So each supported combination is called binding. So in binding, if you see this this example, in SOAP binding, so here the style is either RPC or document. You need to define that exclusively. Again, for another operation, you need to do the same thing, and also you need to define the what is the transportation type. Whether it is an HTTP, how you are allowing the user to send a request to the web service. So the request can be sent either on an HTTP or a JMS message or any other format. Okay.
Sir?
Yes.
Sir, transport type is basically the protocol that we are following to exchange the message, right?
That's right, yes. Transportation is nothing but the protocol.
Okay.
Protocol can be anything like a HTTP protocol or a JMS protocol, or even a TCP also is allowed. But mostly it is SOAP over HTTP.
Okay. Yes. Look at this, the pictorial representation. Now you have a port type called string util. I didn't show you the another port type. Now for that particular port type, you have two different bindings. In this case, in the binding, you are defining one format as SOAP and transportation as HTTP. And for the same port type, you are also allowing, with a different name binding to, you are also allowing the request to be coming over an SMTP email and format as text. So you can support different formats, and you need to define all those formats that are supported by the web service in the binding element. So if you see an example here, so for example, if it is SOAP over HTTP, it will come in this format: concat request S1 element and S2 element concat request. This is the document style, concat request, which we defined in the schema. For example, if it is SMTP or an email, so this is how it comes: from, to, and the SOAP body as a simple plain text. And the web service will be able to, so in case if you are using an Axis 2, what it does is it takes that SOAP request and converts that XML into an Java object, because you don't work on the XML directly, right? So that process of converting XML to an object is called marshalling. Okay, so someone has to enter, the entire request response is happening in the form of an XML, right? The entire request response, I told you why we are using XML. XML is a form of communication between system to system. So once you receive an XML, before you can process on and work on the content of the XML, first that XML has to be converted to an object, and that has to be done by someone. Instead of you doing it manually, if you use a framework like Axis 2 or CXF, upon receiving the response, the XML will be converted to an object, which is called the process of marshalling. Okay. So
Here you are specifying various formats that you can receive, but it doesn't matter to you. Ultimately, you will get a Java object that you can work on, that you can process upon and send the response back in the format of an XML again. So now you defined binding. The next one is in this XML, if you see, service. So service have different ports. What it means is, and within the service, for each port you need to tell which binding is supported. I told you when you deploy a web service, every web service has to have a port defined. Like when you have a web server deployed on your local machine, you are assigning, or the system is assigning a port to the installed application, like for example 8080. So similarly, for every binding you need to assign a port. So that is done using visual port binding equal to, depending upon how many, these are all called endpoints. Depending on how many endpoints are there, you need to assign those many ports, or depending on how many